Vanessa, welcome to the show. How you doing today?
I can't hear anything. 1 second.
Oh, okay.
Not quite sure why.
Okay, you're working out. I'm gonna give your bio. Vanessa Beeley. Give her bio. Vanessa Beeley. She's an international investigative journalist. You can follow her on Twitter at Vanessa Beeley. You can read her articles. I need to make sure that the bio is still correct in regards to the articles and everything else. But Vanessa, can you hear me yet? She cannot hear me yet. She has that look of concentration. It's okay.
1 second.
It's okay. You're okay.
Let me sign out and come back in again. Sorry.
Okay. Look, Lath is not toxic. He's not. He is. You have to allow for other people's experience. You just do. It's just life. Obviously, I disagree with some of the takes, but that's secondary again to the point that that's a legit feeling. And if you're taking a litmus test of people in the Middle East, that may be the feeling. That's not being toxic. That's you watching a country fall. You're watching ethnic minorities being murdered in that country. I mean, for God's sake, Syria had these gorgeous women in bikinis on the beach weeks before jihadist animals, the hordes, invaded and overthrew the country. Put that in context. And if that's your country, and you're watching your country effectively not just fall, but a terrorist organization take over that country with the help of the West, you may feel salty. He's not toxic. He's just been straight. But that's how you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now. I don't know what happened. Something went wrong in the ether.
It is okay. Success is a damn good thing. How you doing today? You doing all right?
Yeah. You know, with the state of the world, it's quite hard to maintain any kind of buoyancy, but we try.
You are not the only one that have told me that. I've had conversations with people who have been in the depths of depression over the stuff, especially people who are living in the area or related to the area. And just for the audience, Vanessa Beeley, she's an investigative journalist. Vanessa, where can people find your work right now? This may be old.
No. The best place is probably at Substack. That's where I sort of publish pretty much everything. Telegram, and X, YouTube. Under Vanessa Beeley. It's very easy to find.
Okay. All right. I will put this in your bio. The reason I brought you on, I saw a post that you made, and it piqued my interest. And it wasn't just you who made this post. Another gentleman, Kavork, also made a video. And both of you were effectively talking about this depressing scene that came out of the Kremlin the other day.
Yes. You mean the welcome of Al-Qaeda to the Kremlin? Yes.
Yeah. And Putin shaking his hand.
God. Look at them
and
all.
There's this still frame of this that I'm fascinated by. Look at Putin's face. He clearly doesn't want to be there. And he clearly doesn't want to be in this picture. But he's in this picture.
I don't know.
Let's get into that.
I don't know.
Let's get into that.
I might disagree with you on that one.
No,
I mean, Putin's face is incredibly inscrutable anyway. You know, it's very difficult usually to tell what he's thinking or so on. But
it looked like he had to either go to the bathroom or he just didn't want to be there. But fair enough. He's like, oh my God, this picture is being taken.
Might have something to do with standing next to someone that's towering over him as well.
That too, right? It's like this is the hand that's chopped off heads. That's a rough thing to watch, especially for people who paid attention to all of this take place, who knows that as he's shaking that man's hand, that ethnic minorities are being murdered and slaughtered with his gangs doing it. And who felt some kind of way as the Syrian government collapsed. That is a difficult picture to watch. Give me your take, just in general, of all of this. Because you pointed out this is a dark day in Russian history. And I'll let you go and explain why you say it in that way.
Look, I think the position I take is that Russia, the mistake that was made, in my humble opinion, as someone that was living in Syria for the last 5 years and remained until Damascus had actually fallen and was present on the ground during the last battles, from basically Tartus to Hama, Homs, and then I ended up in Damascus the day before it actually fell.
Wow, I didn't know that.
I think, yeah, I mean, I literally had an hour to pack a bag and take my dog and get out of Syria on the Sunday morning, so on the 8th. So I think, first of all, I want to sort of bring in the context that, from my perspective, the mistake that was made in Syria by the leadership was in believing that Russia was an ideological ally. And while when I look at the bigger picture, there were mistakes made on both sides throughout Russia's intervention. So from 2015 up until December 2024, there was mistakes made from the leadership of Syria. And I think from 2020 onwards, when Trump brought in the Caesar sanctions, which were on top of, 10 years, 9 years of war and energy deprivation, because, of course, the United States was occupying the Northeast and the oil and agricultural resources there, both directly and through its proxies, first of all, ISIS, and then the Kurdish factions in the Northeast. And Idlib had been allowed to fester, the armed groups there, under the dominance of Jolani. I wouldn't say leadership, because Jolani was maneuvered into position. The US, Washington, carried out assassinations of his main opposition in Idlib to ensure that he remained in power. And we know that, interestingly, that combined with, from 2020, when we also had the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, the leader of the Iraqi resistance, by Trump, who had lured them into a trap under the auspices of it being a diplomatic mission. And then, of course, we know that they were assassinated. So all of this kind of combined, in my opinion, from 2020 to really push Syria into an economic freefall, which, and again, we have to remember that this situation is orchestrated, right? Which allowed corruption to flourish. In my opinion, again, it's reduced the central governance and dispersed it into mafia cartels that were running the country from different areas of influence and corruption. And that included the Syrian Arab Army. At the same time, Russia was pushing President Assad towards normalization with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This was very much Russia's plan, because Russia actually wanted to get Iran and Hezbollah out of Syria. That was very clearly their plan, to increase their influence on Assad, to benefit from their relationship with Assad, to consolidate on their position in Syria, of course, on the coast, but also in the northeast, in Qamishli, and in the south. And by doing so, to a large degree, they reduced Assad's relationship with Iran and with Hezbollah. They damaged it, actually. In 2023, Damascus expelled the Ansarullah embassy. This was on the basis, it was negotiated by Iran, but it was on the basis that Saudi Arabia, if this were to happen, would increase humanitarian aid to Syria, which we never saw happen. And by pushing Assad towards Saudi Arabia and UAE, what this ultimately means, of course, is pushing Syria towards some kind of normalization with Israel. And I genuinely believe this is what Russia was trying to achieve. Why do I think that? Because if we look at the Russian relationship with Israel, they don't have necessarily cast iron strategic agreements and partnerships in place, but they have what is known as a beneficial mutual friendship. And in 2015, actually, when Russia intervened in the war in Syria to effectively damage or prevent the advance of ISIS in particular, Netanyahu went on record as saying it's fine because Russia's objectives or Russia's agenda in Syria is the same as ours. This is a very interesting statement. Why would he say this? During Russia's presence in Syria under President Assad, they had around 49 phone calls between them, between Netanyahu and Putin. We know that Russia effectively had come to an agreement with Israel that it wouldn't interfere with Israel's attacks on Iranian advisors, military advisors, and military on the ground, or with Hezbollah. And of course, towards the end of 2023, 2024, we saw the assassination of Iranian officials, even at the Iranian embassy, which is, I mean, this is a war crime in itself, right? Iranian generals have been very clear about the fact that they believe Russia turned off its radars whenever there was an Israeli attack. Russian air defense didn't participate in the taking down of missiles. They weren't necessarily needed, to be fair. The Syrian Arab Army did an excellent job with relatively rudimentary equipment. I mean, it's still good equipment, but they did a good job with what they had, because a lot of people talk about, you know, the fact that Russia had effectively supplied the S-300s, but we were told that they had never actually really given the Syrian army the training needed to use the S-300s. At the same time, Russia was providing a service to Israel in the south by effectively acting as a kind of UNIFIL policing operation on the border with the occupied Golan territories. This was in order to prevent Iranian or Hezbollah or Palestinian resistance factions reaching the border of the occupied Golan territories, right? So they were effectively defending Israel's occupation of the Golan. If we then also think about, I mean, there's 100 million things I could talk about, but let's focus on Idlib, for example. In 2019, the Syrian Arab Army had made massive inroads in the liberation of southern Idlib, northern Hama, which borders Idlib.
Right.
And they had the opportunity to actually advance and take Idlib. They could have done so. At this point, Russia and Iran came to an agreement that they would halt those advances on the basis that Turkey would basically dismantle the Al-Qaeda elements over time, right? What happened? This is history now. We know what happened, right? Is that Turkey effectively used that opportunity to increase its bases in Idlib. It basically invaded. I remember being in Sarakeb, which is in southern Idlib, in, when was it, 2018. Mm-hmm. And the army had just retaken Sarakeb, the Syrian army. It was Turkish drones that attacked, and I was there when the charred bodies of the Syrian army soldiers were driven past us in lorry loads, truckloads, to the hospital. And it was temporarily retaken by the terrorist factions. Russian air defense did nothing. And at that point, Lavrov actually sent a message of condolence to Erdogan on the death of Turkish soldiers, military, that had invaded Syria. So this is just, I'm talking partly as analysis, partly from what I actually saw on the ground. Another time I was in Jurin, which is a small town in northern Hama, southern Idlib. And from the town, you could actually see the Turkish outposts and surveillance installations. And while I was actually interviewing a family in Jurin, we were attacked. How do I know that we were directly attacked? Was because the shelling came in at decreasing distances away from where we were. So we knew that they were actually honing in on where we were, right? So all of this was effectively facilitated by Russia, even down to the fact that the humanitarian corridors at Bab al-Hawa, for example, that were being used by the UN, but of course were being abused by the armed groups to bring in weapons and equipment, and also to provide revenue for those armed groups, were not fully closed down. Bab al-Hawa and one other corridor was still running, and Russia didn't veto this. And I remember having a conversation, it's like, why aren't you shutting these corridors down? Because effectively they're just bringing in equipment and forces to enable the development, the reinforcement, and the rearming of all of these various terrorist groups that, under the Russian facilitated reconciliation agreements, were bussed out of the various areas that were liberated by the Syrian Arab Army into Idlib. So what happened? Every single area of conflict that was effectively liberated by the Syrian Arab Army, all of the terrorists from those particular areas were bussed into Idlib. So can you imagine? There were literally hundreds of thousands that were gathering in Idlib that had the maintenance of supply through Turkey into Idlib that was providing revenue, arms, training. And in the last year, very important, Ukraine was coming in. Ukrainian special forces were coming into Idlib and training, combat training, Jolani's forces, and Jolani in return was sending militia to Ukraine to fight against Russia. And yet still Idlib was left festering, if you like, in preparation for what happened November 2024, December 2024.
The UN had pointed out that there were like 50,000 terrorists in Idlib, meaning they acknowledge that this is a terrorist haven. How do you explain that? Like put your analysis hat on for me for a moment. Why would they allow Idlib to continue to exist? Why would they trust Erdogan, who's a snake in the grass?
Yeah, I mean,
like nobody trusts Erdogan. I don't understand. I didn't understand why Idlib continued to exist. Immediately, Russia, Iran, and Syria had taken back the overwhelming majority of the territory.
Yeah.
Why would they stop there?
It's a very good question. Whether it was totally based on trust of Turkey, I think to a degree it is, and it's a fatal mistake if that really is the case. And actually, you know, what happened in the end is very complex. Turkey fell into a trap, but it pulled Russia into a degree of a trap also by basically fooling them into thinking they could trust Erdogan to end what was happening in Idlib rather than increase it and use it as this opportunity for him to expand his annexation of Syrian territory. He now holds, you know, a vast swathe of Syrian territory across the north, from Aleppo across to basically the Euphrates and beyond the Euphrates, so in the northeast, that's the Kurdish factions, right? So that's a very difficult question to answer, to be honest. If I want to put on my very cynical hat and seeing now the collaboration between Russia and Israel, perhaps this was eventually part of the ultimate plan. Because the thing is that when you look at what Russia facilitated, and even myself at the time, I thought, okay, this is good because Syria is showing mercy to these armed groups and so on. They're giving them amnesty and reconciliation. They're giving them an opportunity to be resegregated into Syrian society, to be reabsorbed into the Syrian armed forces. But they betrayed the Syrian armed forces on a number of occasions. There was a massacre in Kabul in the outskirts of Damascus because of the reabsorption of these armed groups that basically gave away the positions of the Syrian Arab army to the terrorist groups, right? And at the same time, in Dara, in the south, and you have to remember, Russia negotiated all of these amnesty and reconciliation because they were seen as a neutral power, a neutral peace broker, if you like, between Damascus and the armed groups, many of which also are not Syrian. We have to remember that. When Russia effectively took control of Dara in the south, and again, I went there after it had come under the control of Russia, what they would do is they would effectively leave the areas that they had administration of from a reconciliation perspective. They would leave those areas under the control of elements of the armed groups that remain behind. So in Dara, it was Shabab al-Sunnah who remained in control. And Russia actually then formed the 5th Corps, which is part of the 8th Brigade, I hope I've got that right, under the control of Ahmed al-Awda. So these were a conglomeration of armed groups that were brought under the Russian umbrella and left to basically police the area around Dara. And it's interesting to note that when Damascus fell, they were the first to enter Damascus, not HTS, not Jolani. They were the first. And they were the ones who actually, apparently, according to various testimonies, they were the ones that extricated President Assad and took him to the airport. And from there, we know he went to Khammim and then to Moscow, where he's been given humanitarian asylum, not political asylum, which I find still is bothering me.
What's the difference?
The difference is basically, I think, under Russian law, political asylum gives you immediately far more rights. You have the right to become a Russian citizen. You have some defense against extradition. Humanitarian asylum is sort of less inclusive, less comprehensive. I'm not an expert on Russian law, but I did look it up on AI, so I can't guarantee that the answer is 100%
There's
correct.
obviously a difference. Otherwise, they would call it political.
Yeah, there is a big difference. And political asylum is not very often handed out, of course, by Russia. But you would think that someone that had been an ally of President Putin since he came to power, so since 2000, I mean President Assad, you would think that there would be political asylum, not only humanitarian asylum. If someone is an expert in asylum laws in Russia, please feel free to fill me in on any details that I'm missing. It's just a question I've raised because I don't quite understand why it's only humanitarian asylum.
Explain something to me. Russia, the deal that they've effectively made with Jolani, Jolani is effectively a stooge of Istanbul. At the very least, that's the way it's understood. Turkey has a massive sway in regards to the politics and affairs of Syria currently. The basis that Russia made a deal with in order to maintain, you would think that those bases will be in a much weaker position under the current regime as opposed to under Assad. Meaning, as you point out, that relationship with Assad went back from the time that Putin got into office. Why would they be willing to give that up? That just seems to be such a loss. Like it seems to be a profound loss, not just for Syria, but also for the relationship between these two countries.
But I don't think Russia perceives that it has given it up. This is my point. This is where I think you have to look at the pragmatic realpolitik of this, right? I think what Russia is doing is what is best for Russia. And this is my point. I don't think anybody should see, and I'm not actually saying there's anything wrong in that, by the way. But what I'm saying is that people should stop attaching their own ideological vision onto what Russia is doing, because I think that is the mistake. Because if we look at what Russia has done, or what has actually happened since the fall of Damascus, first of all, the president or a representative from Belarus came to broker a meeting between Jolani's regime and Bogdanov, the deputy foreign minister from Russia. This was within 6 weeks. So within 6 weeks, Russia had legitimized Jolani's completely unelected Takfiri regime, which is stuffed full of foreign Takfiri. And that's another issue that I want to come on to, how many Chechens and Northern Caucasus elements are within Jolani's regime that Russia doesn't want to come back to Russia, right? They want them contained inside Syria. So that's another very important point. So they were among the first to legitimize Jolani's regime. And in a sense, if you remember, Putin's statement after the fall of Damascus was odd. And I remember having a number of discussions on social media where people were saying, but it's irony, you know, he's mocking them. Because remember, he said something along the lines of, Al-Qaeda has reformed, so, you know, there's no problem with them now. And everyone was sort of saying, no, he's taking the P. He doesn't really mean this. He's mocking the West and so on. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I don't know what your
you can say it. Yeah, you can say
language rule. And for me, this was a very odd statement to make. And then that was followed so quickly with this legitimization of the regime. And then what we saw was Israel lobbying Trump for Russia to maintain its bases in Syria. So while I agree with you that Jolani is to a large degree Erdogan's instrument of expansion, what's now happening, if you like, is Jolani's being pulled in all directions in the interest of every single power player inside Syria. And that includes Israel, right? And Israel is going to be, it's going to outweigh Turkey because Israel has the backing of Washington and it has the backing of Russia, by the way. As I've said, the relationship between Russia and Israel, Russia will never do anything that threatens Israel. Never. And that's one of the reasons why Russia, as one of the BRICS countries, Putin has never declared that what Israel is doing in Gaza is a genocide. They've maintained trade relations with Israel. They haven't economically boycotted Israel. Lavrov has even basically said that what Israel's goals against Hamas are the same as Russia's goals in Ukraine. You know, so
yes.
We have to understand this relationship between Russia and Israel. It's very important. And we shouldn't downplay it because Russia will protect that relationship at all costs. And we can talk more about this. So in a sense, what is Jolani doing? He's effectively trying to keep all his sponsors happy, which is going to be a very difficult job long term. And not only does he have to keep all his sponsors happy, he has to maintain the loyalty of his Takfiri forces. So if he's seen to pivot too far towards Israel or normalization with Israel, he's going to piss off the more extremist fanatical factions within his forces, which include ISIS. If he basically goes too far towards Russia, the same thing. So he has to keep this weird balance, and that's why you're seeing all of this maneuvering. But ultimately, what is the goal? The goal is to partition Syria, and Russia is part of that goal. Because what is Russia seeing? It's seeing an opportunity to not only consolidate its position on the coast. It's already rebuilding its forces there. It's bringing in more equipment. This is its launch pad to Africa. And Africa is the biggest goal for Russia. And to lose its base in Syria, it can't, because then it would be entirely reliant on Turkey to use Turkish airspace and Turkish facilities to be able to access Africa, right? It can't afford to lose this base. So now what you're seeing, in my opinion, is the coming to the surface of the close relationship between Israel and Russia. and Russia's opportunity to prevent Erdogan's expansion into Syria. Because what happens every time Turkey tries to expand into Syria? Israel bombs it. We've seen this multiple times. As soon as Turkey tries to provide weapons to Jolani or to build back up the military bases that Israel destroyed back in December 2024, it completely devastated Syrian military capability, air defense, naval forces, and so on. And Turkey has been trying to build that back up on behalf of Jolani, but they've not been allowed to, because every time they go beyond their border of Aleppo and into central Syria, they're bombed by Israel, right? So Israel and Russia are focused on containing Turkey. But Russia is also focused on basically returning to the position it had under Assad, which is to consolidate its position on the coast. And there is talk I've seen, and I agree with it, that part of the discussion with Jolani was for Jolani's Takfiri forces to withdraw from the coast, for Russia to be given control of the coastal area and the ability to bomb the Takfiri forces in that area. So what does that mean? Russia takes full control of the coastal area and potentially partitions it off as an Alawite state. By doing that, it pushes France out of the picture, because France historically had the mandate in the coastal area. It had the mandate of the Alawite state, right? And it's been desperately trying to invest into, maintain its investment in Latakia port. So in my opinion, Russia is maneuvering for this. It's maneuvering to take that big piece of the Syrian cake totally under its control as a protectorate. At the same time, it's increasing its presence in Qarmishli in the northeast. And even Jolani is saying it will be marvelous if Russia will go back and police the south and, wait for it, prevent Israeli expansion. This is nonsense. Russia's not going to do anything to prevent Israeli expansion. It's best friends with Israel, right? What it is going to do is to provide the same service to Israel as it provided under President Assad, which is to prevent a Takfiri presence or to prevent the rise of any possible Syrian resistance factions, because we have been seeing some attacks on Israeli forces that have come into Syrian territory in the south, particularly in Quneitra and in Dara. Mm-hmm. And why is this important? Because basically Israel wants control of all of the south and Sweda, where we've seen, this is where it gets very complex, where Jolani had the meeting in Baku with the Israeli officials, and immediately after, the massacre of the Druze in Sweda began. So this was clearly orchestrated. Jolani was clearly in on it. He weaponized the tribal factions against the Druze factions, but even his own HTS forces and ISIS forces joined in the slaughter of the Syrian Druze in Sweda. And what did that do? It opened the door to Israel to come in as a protector of the Druze in Sweda and take control. Russia will help this, because this will enable Israel's David's corridor to go up the eastern flank of Syria, so the border with Iraq and Jordan, link with the Kurdish factions in the northeast, which gives them full control of Syrians' southern and eastern border, right? So what I'm trying to say is the discussions in Moscow, in my opinion, one is that Jolani must be aware that he's not going to be allowed to have his military rebuilt by Turkey. This is perfectly clear to him right now. And much, much earlier this year, he had a conversation in Idlib where he was telling people basically, no, it's fine, we'll get weapons from Russia.
Was he?
And
was he?
And he actually said this in an interview with the New York Times. He said basically Trump has washed his hands of them. He's not going to be providing weapons. They can go to Turkey or Russia.
So the Russian military is going to be giving him weapons?
Yeah, but they probably will. If they can make money out of this, they probably will.
I don't get the sense that Israel is going to allow him to get weapons from either Russia or
Oh,
from
he can
Turkey.
have small weapons. Why can he have small weapons? He's not going to be given air defense. He's not going to be given heavy artillery, but he'll be given small weapons. Why? Because if at any point Israel or Turkey decide that, more likely Israel, decide that they want to use Jolani to attack the resistance factions in Iraq and Lebanon, they have the weapons to do it, but not the weapons that can be turned on Israel, right?
Okay, wow. Yeah, that's a tweaking point of view. So, but is it possible that what we're seeing is a fallback position? Because Russia, in its relationship with Assad, it already had access to Africa in the way that it wanted access to Africa. Its bases were safe. They didn't have to have all of this to take place. You've had a relationship with someone that went back for decades. It just seems
they
killing
did,
that
but they were frustrated for multiple reasons. They were frustrated that Assad wasn't basically in agreement with the whole Astana policy of redrawing the constitution. He'd been extremely stubborn on that, right? Secondly, he'd refused any meeting with Erdogan to resolve issues. And his point was, why would I talk to Erdogan until he withdraws from Syrian territory and withdraws the terrorists that he's basically funding and arming, which are the Syrian National Army, which were previously the Free Syrian Army, that are basically under Turkish control, and they're now the ones that are occupying the north and the majority of Aleppo. He wasn't fully doing what I think Russia wanted him to do, which was to expel Iran and Hezbollah completely. Remember, back in 2018, there was a bit of a row between Iran and Russia because Russia was pushing Assad to do that back then. So that was back in 2018, right?
Why was Russia? Why was Russia pushing him to expel Iran? Both of these countries were working together in order to beat back the terrorists the first time around.
I think because Russia basically wanted the share of the largest share of influence in Syria. Iran was seen as a threat because if Iran expanded into Syria, this is how I believe Russia saw it, and I was told this by a number of Russian officials over the years that I was in Syria, that they saw Iran not so much as an ally but as a competitor in Syria. You know, we have to remember this is real politics. This isn't even though Russia has now the strategic partnership with Iran, it still doesn't have a mutual defense clause in it. So in other words, if Israel goes to war again with Iran, Russia is not physically going to come in and help Iran, but it will do that for North Korea. It has a mutual defense pact with North Korea, where they will come to each other's defense if either country is attacked. They don't have that clause in the agreement with Iran. And they need Iran to some degree. They need Iran for the North-South trade corridor, which of course is now under threat with the Turkish-Israeli-US expansion into Armenia and Azerbaijan and the Zangezur corridor. So that's why Russia is now negotiating more enthusiastically with the Taliban in Afghanistan, right? So what I'm saying is it all makes sense when you look at it from a realistic perspective, and when you take the ideological content out of the discussion. That's how I tend to view it. In a sense, I understand what Russia is doing. Whoever caused the loss of Assad, that's another very complicated conversation. But however it happened, ultimately Russia had to make sure that they maintained their presence in Syria.
Yeah.
And so if that means legitimizing and recognizing a Takfiri government, clearly for Russia, that's not a problem. And I just want to come back to this point on the terrorists, the Takfiris that are under Jolani's command. There's a huge number. I mean, numbers vary But back in, I think it was 2014, there were something like 14,000 Chechens among the Takfiris in Syria, and also the Uyghurs from China. So China and Russia have an interest in keeping the terrorists inside Syria, right? They don't want them to come back. Between 1999 and 2014, there were multiple massive terrorist attacks by Chechen groups in Russia. And Putin actually said, we would rather fight them in Syria than fight them in St. Petersburg or Moscow.
Of course, right.
Right. So the containment of those Chechen elements is also very, very important to Russia. And even in, I think it was 2014, there were reports, and those have been confirmed, that Russia was effectively facilitating the transit of Chechen terrorists without visa through Turkey and into Syria. So effectively, they were saying, okay, go to Syria, fight with the Takfiris there, and let the Syrian army die fighting them. I'm putting it very bluntly, but that's effectively the case. Russia didn't come in until 2015, right? The Chechen Takfiris were leaving from 2014, 2013 onwards and entering Turkey with no visa and coming into Syria. And it's not only the Chechens, it's the Uzbekistanis, the Tajikistans, the Dagestanis, and so on that make up. I mean, generally, I think the Takfiri forces are around 40% foreign Takfiri. So it's a huge number.
There was a conversation, I think it was Kevork yesterday when he was talking about this. And he was pointing out, like, if you can't maintain your friends, you're going to lose friends. It was something to that effect. He was giving this breakdown. And look, all of us, be it me, you, Laith, all of us feel some kind of way about the fall of Syria. And Laith was making this very strident point about betrayal, in a sense, where it feels like a betrayal. Is that the way it's understood in the region?
Yes. I mean, definitely. I mean, I'm here in Lebanon. I know how many analysts, let's say, on the side of the resistance feel about it. And in Iran, I mean, there were certain members of the Iranian military command who were very blunt about what happened, even down to the fact that Iran was trying to send reinforcements, and apparently it had been agreed between Assad and Putin. And at the last minute, Putin prevented them landing at Haimamin. And they were over Iraq, and they had to go back because the US was threatening to shoot the plane down.
Right.
All of this was made very clear by members of the Iranian command shortly after the fall of Syria. And so, yes, of course, there's a feeling of betrayal, enormously so. I mean, to see this footage of Jolani, and it's not only Jolani, it's his entire entourage. I mean, Asad al-Shaibani, the foreign minister, was one of the co-founders of Al-Qaeda in Syria. The name escapes me. Musaf al-Kahaf, the defense minister, committed atrocities against Syrian civilians. The head of intelligence, who worked very close, Anas al-Khattab, who was one of Jolani's henchmen in Idlib, but also very heavily connected to Turkey, to the Turkish intelligence. And notice there on the left-hand side, his brother, Hussein al-Shara, who was educated in Russia and who has, in my opinion, been instrumental in this normalization with Russia. He's played a very important role in this. But effectively, I mean, you have there Lavrov, you have the foreign ministry, and look at this place.
It's full state.
Right? This isn't a side room. You know? This
is a full state.
This is full pomp and ceremony. It's quite extraordinary. And it's, even though we were fully aware of and I do consider it a betrayal. I consider it a major betrayal. And I go back to the statement that Putin made immediately after the fall, where he blamed it entirely on the collapse or the surrender of the Syrian Arab Army. I would contest that, because the Syrian Arab Army that had fought and died for 14 years to defend Syria, against hordes of Takfiris that were being sent in by, I don't know, more than 80 countries in the world, funded by some of the wealthiest countries in the world, like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, would suddenly surrender. They were betrayed. They were betrayed internally, but in my opinion, they were also betrayed externally. They were not fully prepared. And whether this was mismanagement on the Russian side, and again, we have to remember that there was actually not a huge Russian military force on the ground.
Right.
They had used Wagner. No, well, they'd used the Air Force, yes, but they'd used Wagner basically as a subcontractor. From 2015, it was Wagner that basically liberated much of Syrian territory. And I find it quite interesting. And again, this is speaking to Russian military officials and so on that were on the ground in Syria and are now back in Russia, who have the opinion that had Wagner not been taken out of Syria in around 2021, this wouldn't have happened. So why were Wagner removed? Why were Wagner taken out? And I don't know if you maybe don't remember or weren't aware of, but in 2018, there was a major incident. There was a major clash between the Russian military and Wagner, in the sense that Wagner, Hasham, the Battle of Hasham in 2018, when Wagner and Syrian army forces tried to retake one of the oil fields from the American forces.
Oh,
and
I don't know that.
According to Wagner, the Russian command were fully aware. They were bombed by the Americans. They were slaughtered by the Americans in trying to do this, and the Russian command didn't come to their help at all. And afterwards, when Prigozhin was really angry about this, because he considered that his forces and the Syrian forces had been sacrificed, the Russian command denied all knowledge, basically. So they kind of washed their hands of Wagner and said, no, this was a rogue operation. We didn't know anything about it. And so to a degree, there's many questions that I have more than answers in some ways. Yeah. But to a degree, the relationship that we now see between Russia and Israel, for me, is extremely telling. Because this now means that Russia is entirely collaborating with Israel in order to maintain its presence in Syria. It's not really Jolani. Jolani is to a degree an instrument, but they can manipulate him. And we have to remember this isn't the first of the meetings. Shaibani has been to Moscow. They've had multiple meetings and conversations prior to this. And the other thing, which is important, is that Jolani is pushing for the extradition of Assad. Now, this will be, if Russia capitulates on this,
that's betrayal.
In my opinion, that's the end of their relationship with the entire resistance axis. Because how can countries like Venezuela or Iran or any of these countries that are genuinely resistant against the imperialist axis, or the Zionist bloc, as I call them, how would they be able to trust Russia? They can't, right? I mean, I'm not saying he's going to do it. But the fact that this subject is still on the table, and it keeps coming back to the table, and now there are actual court cases to prosecute Assad inside Damascus that are being brought by lawyers under Jolani's tutelage, of course. And the statements that they're putting out are not exactly negative about Russia's reaction. In their opinion, it's just going to take time. So, okay, that could be propaganda from their perspective. And everyone is telling me, no, Russia would never betray someone that they've given asylum to and so on. It depends. In my opinion, cynically, it depends what the incentive is.
Vanessa, we're going to have to end this and I'm going to have to bring you back because I want to continue this conversation. I am riveted by this. My mind is blown, and my mind is blown because it's a workable point of view, right? It's like how you see something and how you weigh it. And somebody can say, well, look, I weigh this differently, and this is why I weigh this differently. And they give you an explanation of why they weigh it differently. And look, you've been in that region. You have talked to all sorts of people in this region, Russian, Syrian, Iranian, otherwise.
Yeah.
That is.
And I just want to make one thing clear, if I can. I'm not, how can I put this? There are many Russians, for example, that were in Syria prior to 2018, who were against many of the policies from the Russian regime and from Putin in Syria. So it's not like a homogenous policy. There are many people, even in Russia, in my opinion, that are against what has happened in Syria and is happening in Syria, just to be very clear.
This is disturbing. This is very disturbing to me. I have to have you back, and I would love if you come back next week to continue this conversation.
Of course, I would love to.
Vanessa Beeley, she is an international investigative journalist, and you can find her work on Substack.com. You can also find her work on YouTube under Vanessa Beeley. Thank you for this really great breakdown. A fantastic breakdown. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Jamal.
Absolutely.